So today I am going to get into this real quick. We are going to talk about 5 great sewing tips that I wish I knew before I started sewing. And I was going to get dressed up like I normally do, but I just have a plain knit t-shirt on because we were just going to get right into it and get into the meat of this video right now. So, number 1. I have my notes, just one second. Oh, all right, so when you want to start sewing, so this video is kind of more for a beginner sewer, but not really, because I could probably use all of these tips like 6 months into sewing or even a year after, because there's a couple of things I'm gonna mention that will be helpful, hopefully. So number 1, if you're gonna start sewing, and you are looking for what machine to get, I'm not going to tell you which one to get because I have had good experience with plenty of brands, so I'm not going to tell you what to get. However, I do think, and I heard this from Katie Kortman, so this is not really my idea, but it makes complete sense. But I do think that you should get a machine that is a really good brand with a good name behind it, but like maybe lower line. So to give you an example, when I was really stepping up my sewing, I had a machine from Walmart and it was pretty good. Like, it did everything I needed to. It was fine. It barely gave me any trouble. But when I really started sewing a lot and I wanted to get a little bit more advanced, I went ahead and I looked into the FAF machines. And I got something called a FAF Passport, which is the absolute bottom of the line, like, for their machines. But it was made so well, and it had the IDT technology, which is like an automatic walking foot, that it really stepped up my sewing and made me really comfortable with what I was doing. And my daughter is learning to sew, and she is loving my machine, because it's making her struggles, her normal struggles with sewing, a lot easier, because she was sewing on like a really cheap machine. So it's making her life a lot easier, and it's like she has exploded with her sewing because like her machine isn't breaking every 5 seconds, her bobbin isn't like getting all tangled up, like her needle isn't breaking, you know, like stuff isn't getting stuck, like it's just working a lot more smoothly for her. And so I just feel like that if you're gonna start sewing, you need to make sure it's good enough quality so that you are not gonna have a ton of trouble. Because if you have a lot of trouble, you're gonna hate sewing, and that would be very sad. So do your research, okay? All right, the other thing on this note is when you're a beginner sewer, don't be like me and go out to the store and buy any random pattern without any help and then buy the wrong fabric for it and just get frustrated and completely fail. So the biggest tip I can give for a beginner sewer is I preferred independent patterns when I first started sewing because I felt like magazine patterns, not all of them, but some of them, and the Big 4 patterns sometimes are great, but the instructions on some of them are not as good as like some of the independent patterns that literally explain every single step. Now they are getting better, and a lot of their beginner like learn to sew patterns are really good, and they are explaining. So if you see anything like learn to sew, that will help you like with every single step, like when to finish your seams and things like that. But if you are not able to find one of those, then I would just go ahead and find an independent pattern. I started with Violet Field Threads patterns because I was sewing a lot for my daughter when I very first started sewing, and their patterns literally taught me how to sew. Like, I know this for a fact because they explained everything in such good detail with so many steps and so many pictures. And so I felt really confident after those patterns to move on to more advanced patterns. So they explain things so much that now when I go back to one, I'm like, oh, why is this so long? And I'm wishing I had like an abbreviated version. Anyway, so the important thing is when you're starting sewing, machine and like independent patterns or patterns that you know will be helpful for you to learn how to sew. Like any patterns that you've heard of that are very good at explaining things or break everything down step by step, like, or half steps or quarter steps or anything like that. I do have a coveted list of independent pattern companies that I am obsessed with that have really good instructions. I'm not going to go through it right now because that would make the video a lot longer, but I am going to have a video like that a little bit later. So we will have that to watch later, and if you're interested in that. So the other thing is there are a lot of online sewing classes as well. I did one on Blueprint, and I'll put a link for that down below. And there's so many sewing classes on there. I learned how to knit and crochet on Blueprint and sew. Stitch Sisters UK has a free beginner sewing class, and they are really good at teaching. So that was a very, very good resource. And yeah, that's pretty much all I was going to say for point one. Just a beginner sewer, get your videos in line or your online classes in line, get your machine in line, and get your first pattern in line. And that is a good starting point. The other thing I was going to say is if you are buying a machine, make sure that it at least has a buttonhole foot, because it probably won't have this black thing attached to it, but make sure it at least has like this little like long rectangular thing, because that is very, very helpful when you're making a buttonhole. And most basic machines have that. So just make sure you can do a zigzag stitch, a straight stitch. It can back stitch, obviously, which even super old machines can do that. And it has a buttonhole foot. Those things are really, really helpful. So you're going to want to have that. Other than that, you don't need any other kind of stitch, really. All right, so that was kind of long, but we're going to speed through the rest. Number 2. Okay. So along the lines of a good sewing machine, a good sewing class, good patterns, you need good fabric. I have talked about this before in my fabric clean out video, but I cannot stand it when sweet little beginning sewers grab like the cheapest, most ridiculous fabric from who knows where that is completely off grain, which means like instead of the print that's on there being exactly with the grain or printed on grain exactly, sometimes a print will be like crooked from the grain. So it's like in order for your garment to have the picture that's printed on there straight up and down, your garment's gonna have to be off grain because it's like printed so badly. And you would notice that when you fold the salvages together, which are the ends on the vertical edges. When you fold the salvages together, if they don't meet up exactly and have a perfect fold in the middle, then your fabric is off grain and is warped. So I was a beginning sewer and I was buying cheap fabric. I'm not going to say from where. And I had fabric that was severely off grain, and it was so frustrating. And I was like feeling like I was a failure because I was sewing with fabric that wasn't good and my garments weren't turning out because I did something wrong, but really it was the fabric. So it doesn't have to be silk or rayon or any of those more difficult fabrics to sew with, but like a really good linen is very nice to sew with. It presses very well. It's stable. It doesn't slide around. Quilting cotton is actually not a bad fabric to sew with. It's thick enough to where it also doesn't slide around. It presses really well. Even a cotton lawn is very good to sew with. It does all those things I've said. The only thing with a cotton lawn is you might have to use a different needle, just like a more delicate needle, but other than that, it's really easy to sew with. Anything like a woven cotton, don't start with knits. That'll just make you crazy. That's just my opinion. Some people don't agree with me, but once you get the hang of knits, they're really easy, but they're too scary to start with. But yeah, do your best to spend a little bit of money, even if it's a plain color. Even muslin is sometimes better to just start sewing with, because a lot of times it's usually fine. It's on grain, like you can fold it and it's fine, and it's made well. But yeah, just a simple linen or or, you know, even like a tablecloth is like, can be better, like a linen tablecloth can be better than really bad fabric, okay? So please buy good fabric. Otherwise you'll get frustrated and you will want to quit sewing and you will lose a lifetime of love and affection for sewing. All right. Isn't it funny that I said that these were going to be short and I literally can't like stop talking? Anyways, okay, the other thing right along with this fabric tip, always, this is what I do, you don't have to do it, but I always wash my fabric right when I receive it. I make a card for it to go on the inside to tell me what kind of fabric it is, how much I have, and where it's from. And then I know that, and I put a little W on the card note so that I know that I washed that fabric. That way, when I want to make a garment, I can just grab the fabric out. It's already washed. I can just immediately start sewing with it. So I do that. That's like one of my big tips. I didn't do that at first, but I do that now. Number 3. So I am pretty much married to my rotary cutter. When I lay a fabric out to cut, when I lay a pattern and fabric out to cut, I have this long table, which I've talked about in my sewing room tour twice. Actually, I have 2 sewing room tours, but my sewing room tour redo, I recently talked about this table, and it's really long and it's wide enough for my fabric to fold in half. So that's how I cut my fabric. And I also use a paint can, 4 of them to be exact, to act like risers to raise it up to my height. But anyways, I digress once again. I use a rotary cutter to cut out all of my patterns. I do use scissors for rare types of fabric or like fabric that's really difficult to cut through with the rotary cutter. Although this rotary cutter is amazing, and I will link it down below. LDH makes amazing scissors and rotary cutters. Anyway, I use the rotary cutter, I use my pattern weights, and I did not do that at first, but this, to me, everyone has different opinions, but to me, this is, to me, this is by far the fastest and easiest way to cut out patterns, and it's also very accurate. And you don't have to move your fabric up and down as you pass the scissors underneath. So this is what I do to cut out my fabric. I use my risers, and then I also use marking pins. And I have gone through so many different kinds of marking pins. I've used chalk, I've used wax paper with like the tracing paper with the wheel. I've used water soluble markers. I've used air soluble markers, which is like the purple one, but that one like literally disappears, and I'm like, if you sew with it the next day, it's gone. The water soluble ones are good, but sometimes they take a really long time to come off. Like with the water, they don't always like come off that easily. So I've started using a lot of these heat erasable pins, which I think are so cool. And so I can make a mark on the fabric. The only thing is if you're adding interfacing, and this is a tip for any kind of marking tool you're using, but if you're adding interfacing to a piece, I don't mark the fabric until after I add the interfacing, because obviously if you have heat erasable pins, well, it'll erase all your markings, obviously. If you're marking it on the wrong side and you cover it with interfacing, then your markings are gone. So it's just a waste of time to mark it until after you add your interfacing. And then when you add your interfacing, then you go and mark your pattern piece. You put your pattern piece back on top of your fabric and you mark all the marks. That's what I do. The other thing is, if you have a piece that you have marks on with a heat erasable pen and you're having to fold like a hem or just fold in like 3/8 of an inch if it's like a waistband or something, like before you attach it, make sure you extend your marks, because whenever you iron that hem, they're gonna disappear. So that's another thing. I got these from Madame Sew. They actually sent them to me, and I will link their website below, but got all these different colors, and white is great because when you have dark fabric, you can't see all these other colors. So I have the blue, white, black and red. So I have those, and that's kind of been my preference lately. I don't really cut into my fabric anymore. I have found that it causes it to run, and then if you're serging, like if you're cutting the side of a pant or a side seam and you're snipping notches, and then it tells you to finish your seam before you put it together, well then you can't see your notches anymore because they're serged together if you've snipped them. So yes, I don't do that anymore. I pretty much just mark everything with a pen. So yeah, so that's that category. Let me see. All right, number 4. I do not use pens. Okay, let me back up. I use pens for rare occasions, but when I am sewing seams together, I do not pen them. This is basically what I do. This is just an example. If it's a really long seam, I will usually pin the top, and then I might pin like the middle or like where there's a notch, and then I'll pin like the very bottom. Or I may not pin the bottom, but I'll at least like stretch out the whole seam and make sure if I match up my notches, will the ends be, will the raw edges and will the actual ends line up? So I make sure my seam lines up for sure. And then I check it every once in a while. Since I'm not pinning, you know, things can shift, things can be pushed, things can be moved. And so when I get to my notch, or, you know, if there's 3 notches, when I get to my second notch, I kind of take the fabric and I pull, not pull hard, but I just kind of line it up together and I say, is that still going to be even? And sometimes if it's a little off, like the top is longer than the bottom or the bottom's longer than the top, if it's a lot, then I will just rip it out and redo, and that hardly ever happens. But if it's just a little, sometimes I'll just pull a little tension on the one that's shorter, and it ends up like lining up at the end and looking great. So that is what I do. That's something that I do for pretty much every seam. Unless it's gathering, then I definitely pin. If it's a waistband, I definitely pin, like if I'm folding a waistband over. And then if it's a sleeve, I always pin. Now granted, I probably use less pins, especially if it's like not gathered at all. If the sleeve head is not gathered at all to fit into the sleeve, the armhole, then I don't really pin it. But if it's gathered, I definitely pin it. So those kind of things, curves, I pin curves too. Like all those things I pin. Unless it's like a pant, like I'm making pants and it's just a crotch seam, then I will just pin where the seams come together. Or if it's an underarm seam, I will pin where the underarm seams are supposed to meet, and then I will just serge here or sew to here, check the seams are good, and then sew down. So I'll pin seams and things like that. So the next thing I wanted to say about sewing without pins, when you're doing stripes, I wanted to show this as an example. My machine, no matter how much I decrease my presser foot pressure, it tends to still push my top fabric forward just a little bit. And I even have the IDT technology on my faff, which is kind of like a walking foot on the top. Well, it is a walking foot on the top. So I shouldn't have that kind of trouble, but when you're really trying to match stripes and you want them to be perfect, and it can be really annoying. And the serger pushes as well. My serger has presser foot pressure and I do decrease it, but it still happens. So when I don't know if you can see this, but if I am sewing stripes and I'm moving along on the seam, I will typically take the top, the fabric on top, put my stripe a little bit higher, tiny bit, like 1/8, maybe less, like maybe 1/16, so that when my fabric is being sewn and the presser foot is pushing down, it kind of pushes it exactly in line and in place. And you can test this with the scrap, and then you can like open it up and see if your stripes match perfectly. With tiny stripes, it's like not as big a deal, but with these giant stripes, if they're off by like an eighth of an inch, it drives me crazy. So I have pulled out so many seams, and because I didn't do that ahead of time or didn't think about that. The other thing is, if you're worried about that method, you can, and you should do this anyway if you're worried about stripes, you can just baste the seam using that method. You don't need to do it quite as much because basting doesn't, it's not a very tight, you know, stitch, and so it doesn't push as hard. But if you just baste it in place and you like the way it looks, then you can just sew it and it should be fine. So those are my tips for like sewing without pins and sewing with stripes. All right, so speaking of waistbands, number 5. This is one of my all-time favorite tips, excuse me. And I am like 99% sure I've shared this in at least 2 other videos, but this is what I do. This is already sewn. These are Winslow culottes that I have made out of this cute ditzy floral fabric, and they're shorts. So when I'm pinning a waistband on the inside, I will pin it like this, up and down, making sure the bottom of the pin goes through like the very edge of the fold. And then I will turn it around. I never stitch in the ditch because I cannot do it. And I don't want to change presser feet to do it. And even when I've tried that presser foot, I still horribly fail. So what I do is I decide to just kind of top stitch on the bottom of the waistband, and that makes sure that I catch the other side of the foot, like the fold on the other side for sure. I leave my pins in because the balls of my pins are at the top. So this is how I do it. So these are the tops of the pins, these are the pin heads, and let's say that this is the left side of your machine and this is the right side, and this is your presser foot, and it's gonna sew along here like this. So if your presser foot is coming along here, it should not hit the balls of, or the heads of the pins over here. And sewing over pins is really not a big deal. You just go slow, not even that slow, but just a little bit slow. And don't have like 5,000 pins, otherwise you'll probably hit one. You just sew over them and it keeps it in place beautifully. And yeah, it really makes a beautiful waistband. Now, if this makes your stomach curdle because you don't want to sew over pins, you can also baste on the inside the edge of the fold so that you can make sure you catch it, and then you can see your basting on the other side and it'll keep it in place, and then you can go ahead and stitch it down. But I prefer the pins because it's one less step and I'm pinning anyway, and it works so well every time. In fact, when I sewed my first waistband, it was so bad, I like reached out to blogs, I reached out to YouTube, I reached out to everybody I knew, and they couldn't understand what my problem was because they're like, waistbands are not a big deal. And I'm like, I didn't understand why I can't do them. Like, and I think what happened, which is my next tip, is that my waistband was horribly off grain. So if you do not cut a good waistband, it will not fold in half very nicely. So it will be like twisted, and there'll be like little like poofs and like little, you know, puffs everywhere. And it's the worst, okay? I know, because it's happened to me. And then when you sew it, if you don't pin it, so let's say you cut it off grain, but it's not like horrible, and you're trying to salvage it. Well, when you pin it, and you keep the pins in, it really keeps it from like twisting more. Now, if you don't keep the pins in and you take them out as you sew, you have a chance, if your presser foot pressure is hard enough, you have a chance of pushing the waistband this way, and the bottom will be wanting to stay, and it'll start creating this ripple, and it'll like twist your waistband because it'll be like pulling like this. And that happened to me as well. So I keep the pins in, everyone's happy, my waistband is good, it's nice and flat, and it's great. If you're worried about your waistband being off grain, you know, pre-press your waistband wrong sides together if it's going to be pressed in half. And if it doesn't press in half like easily and like super super well, then I would just cut a new waistband, because you are going to have a lot of trouble putting it on your pants or your shorts or whatever you're making, or your skirt. So that was so much longer than I thought it was gonna be, but I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it. These are all things I wish I knew. This is not the gospel, okay? Like, you will find so many other people that don't do any of this. They do things completely differently and they're very happy. This is just me. These are things that I wished I would have known. I've gotten a lot of this knowledge from a lot of my friends. I didn't make it up. I didn't invent it. I'm not the first one to invent it. So pretty much everyone on Instagram deserves all the credit for everything I just said. So it would be impossible to tell you all the tips I've got from everybody, but that's what we do, right? We take a little grain of salt from, you know, each person we meet, and then we kind of sort it all through into our head, and we figure out what we like out of what they do, and then we create our own little system. So that's what I've done. Hope you like this video. If you do, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can be notified when I have another video. And then if you want to hit the like button, that will help other people find my video as well, so they can start sewing and have good tips to go on. Anyways, let me know if you have any questions. Talk to you later. Bye. Do your research, okay? The other thing is, don't be like me and go out to the store. The cat attacked the dog. Don't